On a sweltering afternoon in June 1967, just 3 weeks after the Six-Day War had redrawn the map of the Middle East, a silver Peugeot 404 sat parked on a quiet residential street in Tel Aviv, its radio crackling with nothing but static. The car belonged to a respected Egyptian cultural attaché who had assured Israeli customs officials that he was simply there to facilitate humanitarian discussions. In the euphoric aftermath of their stunning military victory, Israeli intelligence officials believed the greatest threats had been neutralized on the battlefield. That Egyptian intelligence networks had been decimated along with their air force and tank divisions. They had no idea that the most dangerous espionage operation ever mounted against Israel was being coordinated from apartments, cafes, and embassy offices throughout their own capital city. And they certainly could not have imagined that a malfunctioning car radio would become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel an entire web of deception stretching from the Nile Delta to the shores of the Mediterranean. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. David Amit sat in the basement workshop of Mossad's Technical Division headquarters on King Saul Boulevard, surrounded by dismantled radios, tape recorders, and various electronic devices seized from suspected foreign agents over the past month. At 34 years old, Amit had spent the better part of a decade developing expertise in signals intelligence and electronic surveillance, skills honed during his mandatory military service and refined through years of studying Soviet and Eastern Bloc communication techniques. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his dark hair fell across his forehead as he hunched over a workbench, and the smell of solder and electrical components filled the air around him. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed constantly, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. The Peugeot's radio had been brought to him that morning by a junior analyst named Rachel Goldstein, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s who had been conducting routine surveillance on diplomatic personnel from Arab nations. She had noticed the Egyptian attaché, a man named Mahmoud Fawzi, making an unusual number of visits to a particular electronics repair shop in the Florentine neighborhood, always carrying the same radio, always emerging empty-handed 20 minutes later, always returning days later to collect it again. On her fifth observation of this pattern, Rachel had made the decision to follow Fawzi to his next destination after one of these visits. He had driven directly to a small cafe in Jaffa, where he sat at an outdoor table for exactly 45 minutes, never ordering food, simply drinking Turkish coffee and reading a newspaper. 3 different individuals had approached his table during that time, each sitting briefly, each engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation before departing. Rachel explained all of this to Amit as she placed the radio on his workbench, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been working double shifts since the war ended. The radio had been confiscated during a supposedly random vehicle inspection, authorized by her supervisor after she had presented her surveillance logs. Fawzi had protested vigorously, insisting it was simply being repaired and that the shop owner would confirm this, but he had been powerless to prevent its seizure. Israeli law in the immediate post-war period gave security services broad authority to inspect and confiscate items from foreign nationals, particularly those from nations technically still at war with Israel. Amit turned the radio over in his hands, feeling its weight, examining the screws that held the casing together. It was a standard Phillips model, popular throughout Europe and the Middle East, nothing obviously unusual about its external appearance. He noted that some of the screws showed recent tool marks suggesting the casing had been opened multiple times. Using a small screwdriver, he carefully removed the back panel, setting each screw in a labeled container on his workbench. He had learned long ago that organization and methodical process were the foundations of good intelligence work, that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in this business cost lives. The internal components looked standard at first glance. The vacuum tubes, capacitors, and wiring all appeared to be original factory specifications. But Amit had been doing this work long enough to trust his instincts, and something felt wrong about the weight distribution. He lifted the radio, tilting it at different angles, listening for any unusual sounds or feeling for any movement that shouldn't be there. There, a slight shift of weight that occurred too slowly, as if something viscous was moving inside. He returned the radio to the workbench and began carefully disconnecting the speaker assembly. Behind the speaker cone, nestled in a custom-fabricated hollow space, he found it. A small sealed container, approximately the size of a cigarette pack, made of thin aluminum and wrapped in black electrical tape. His heartbeat quickened as he photographed the device in place, documenting its exact position before extraction. Using a pair of fine tweezers, he carefully removed the container, noting that it had been secured with a type of adhesive that would allow for repeated removal and replacement. This was not a hastily constructed hiding place. It was engineered, professional, the work of someone with technical training and access to specialized materials. Amit called his supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Avi Scheffler, who had been with Israeli intelligence since before the state's founding. Scheffler arrived within 15 minutes, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence before he appeared in the doorway of the workshop. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with grey hair cut military short and eyes that seemed to catalogue and assess everything they encountered. He looked at the container on Amit's workbench without touching it. "What do we have?" Scheffler said, his voice gravelly from decades of smoking Turkish cigarettes. Amit explained the surveillance pattern Rachel had documented, the unusual repair shop visits, the subsequent meetings at the cafe. Then he pointed to the container. This was hidden behind the speaker assembly, professionally installed, designed for repeated access. The weight and balance suggest there is something inside, possibly documents or film, but I have not opened it yet. I wanted you to see it first. Scheffler leaned closer, studying the container's construction. His expression remained neutral. But Amit could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against his thigh before he caught himself and stopped. This pattern, these meetings, this level of sophistication. "We are looking at a dead drop system," Scheffler said quietly. The radio goes to the repair shop, materials are inserted or extracted from the container. Then Fawzi collects the radio and makes his rounds to pass along whatever information was received or to collect new intelligence to be deposited. It is elegant because it provides multiple layers of deniability. If we had found just the radio with nothing suspicious, Fawzi claims it was being repaired. If we find the container but nothing incriminating inside, he claims ignorance, suggests the repair shop installed it without his knowledge. The two men stood in silence for a moment, both understanding the implications. This was not the work of a lone agent or a small-scale operation. This suggested a sophisticated network, multiple handlers, support infrastructure, and significant resources. In the context of post-Six-Day War Israel, when the nation believed it had achieved decisive victory and temporary security, the existence of such a network was both strategically threatening and psychologically destabilizing. Scheffler made a decision. We open it now, but we document everything. I want photographs at every stage. We need to understand what we are dealing with before we decide our next move. And Scheffler paused, choosing his words carefully. We tell no one outside this room about this until I give explicit authorization. Not the director, not our station chiefs, no one. If this is what I think it is, we have stumbled onto something that will require extremely careful handling. Amit nodded and retrieved his camera, a Nikon F with a macro lens that allowed for detailed close-up documentation. He photographed the sealed container from every angle, ensuring the lighting captured every detail of its construction. Then, using a razor blade with a fresh edge, he carefully cut through the electrical tape, peeling it away slowly to avoid damaging whatever might be inside. The aluminum container had a seam that suggested it opened like a small box, held closed by pressure fit, rather than permanent sealing. He inserted the tip of his smallest screwdriver into the seam and gently pried. The container opened, and inside, protected by a layer of waxed paper, were 3 items. The first was a roll of 35mm film, the type used in standard cameras, in a small metal canister. The second was a folded piece of onion skin paper, covered in handwritten text, using what appeared to be Arabic script. The third was a small booklet, similar to a passport, but with no national identification, containing columns of numbers and letters arranged in groups of 5. Schiefler's face had gone very still as he looked at the contents. The film would be photographs, likely of documents or installations. The handwritten note was probably instructions or intelligence reports, but the booklet, that was a one-time pad, an encryption system that, when properly used, was theoretically unbreakable. Each page contained random number groups that could be used only once to encode or decode messages. The existence of such a sophisticated encryption tool indicated this network had direct communication channels with handlers who possessed matching pads, allowing for secure message exchange that Israeli cryptanalysis had virtually no chance of intercepting and decoding. "We need to develop this film immediately," Schiefler said, "but we need to do it in a way that leaves no indication it has been processed. We need to read what is on that paper and photograph it without leaving traces. And we need to examine every page of that pad without disturbing its condition. Then we need to make a decision, whether we roll up this network immediately or whether we try to turn it into a controlled channel that feeds false information back to Cairo." The two men worked through the night. Amit had access to a darkroom within the technical division, and he processed the film using techniques that left minimal chemical traces. The images that emerged showed documents, military supply manifests, personnel rosters from Israeli Defense Forces bases, photographs of installations along the Suez Canal ceasefire line, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be preliminary architectural drawings of the Dimona nuclear facility in the Negev desert. Someone within Israel's military or government apparatus had access to classified information and was systematically photographing it for Egyptian intelligence. The handwritten note was in classical Arabic, and Schiefler, who spoke the language fluently, translated it aloud as Amit photographed each page. It contained updates on several ongoing collection priorities, including requests for information about Israeli Air Force readiness levels, details about American military assistance packages, and, most specifically, any intelligence regarding Israeli intentions toward the occupied territories in the Sinai Peninsula. The note also referenced several individuals by codename, including someone called Nightingale, who apparently had access to foreign ministry communications, and another called Compass, who worked in some capacity related to military logistics. The one-time pad presented a different challenge. Simply photographing its pages would not reveal how it was being used or what messages had already been encoded or decoded. Amit made a careful photographic record of every page, noting that approximately one-third of the number groups on the first several pages had faint pencil marks next to them, likely indicating they had been used. This suggested the network had been operational for at least several months, possibly longer, and had been actively transmitting intelligence throughout the period leading up to the Six-Day War and continuing afterward. As dawn light began filtering through the small window near the ceiling of the workshop, Schiefler and Amit sat across from each other at the workbench, drinking strong black coffee from paper cups, surrounded by photographs and notes from their night's work. The magnitude of what they had uncovered was settling over both of them. This was not simply an espionage case. It was a security breach that threatened Israel's most sensitive secrets and, if not handled correctly, could undermine public confidence in the intelligence services that had just been celebrated for their role in the war's stunning victory. Schiefler broke the silence. "We need to make an immediate decision about Fawzi. He will expect to retrieve his radio soon. If we return it without the container, he knows we found it, and the entire network will shut down before we can identify anyone beyond him. If we return it with the container empty, same result. If we do not return it at all and simply arrest him, we get one agent, but lose the opportunity to identify the others. And we still do not know who Nightingale and Compass are." Amit had been thinking about this problem throughout the night. What if we return the radio with the container and its contents intact? But we have documented everything and we add a tracking device. We let him make his next round of meetings. We identify everyone he contacts. We follow those individuals to their contacts, and we map the entire network before we take action. Schiefler considered this. It meant allowing classified information to reach Egyptian intelligence, at least temporarily. It meant operational risk and potential political consequences if the decision was later questioned. But it also meant the possibility of completely dismantling a network that, based on the sophistication of what they had found, likely included multiple sources with access to different levels of Israeli government and military. "We do it," Scheffler said finally, "but we do it with full coverage. I want surveillance on Fawzi every moment, from when he retrieves the radio until we decide to shut this down. I want technical surveillance on every location he visits. And we need to bring Rachel in on this. She is the one who spotted the pattern in the first place, and she has already proven she has good instincts." Over the next week, a carefully orchestrated operation unfolded. The radio was returned to Fawzi with an apologetic explanation that the random inspection had been overzealous and that Israeli authorities had no wish to interfere with legitimate diplomatic personnel. Hidden inside the speaker assembly, nestled next to the original container which had been meticulously reassembled and sealed exactly as found, was a tiny transmitter that Amit had designed specifically for this operation. It broadcast a signal that could be picked up by receivers within a half-kilometer radius, allowing surveillance teams to track the radio's location without maintaining close visual contact that might alert trained counter-surveillance operatives. Fawzi collected the radio with barely concealed relief, his hands trembling slightly as he signed the receipt. He drove directly back to his apartment building in northern Tel Aviv, a modern structure that housed several other diplomatic personnel from various nations. Surveillance teams, coordinated by Rachel from a command post established in a rented apartment 3 blocks away, tracked his movements using a combination of the radio transmitter, visual observation from multiple fixed positions, and mobile units that rotated coverage to avoid pattern recognition. 48 hours after retrieving his radio, Fawzi made his move. At 7:30 in the evening, he left his apartment carrying a leather briefcase and the radio, now wrapped in a wool blanket. He drove to the electronics repair shop in Florentin, the same establishment Rachel had identified in her original surveillance. He entered carrying the radio and emerged 22 minutes later carrying the briefcase but not the radio. Surveillance teams photographed everyone who entered or left the shop for the next 6 hours. The shop owner, a thin man in his 60s named Mossad, closed at his normal time of 9 o'clock. 40 minutes later, a delivery van from a wholesale electronics supplier arrived at the rear entrance of the shop. A man in his early 30s, later identified as Yosef Barak, entered through the back door using a key, stayed inside for approximately 30 minutes, then departed, carrying a small package roughly the size of the radio. This was the transfer point. Zur, the shop owner, served as an intermediary, providing a location where materials could be moved between operatives without direct contact. Barak became the focus of intensive investigation. Records showed he worked as a technician for the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, a position that required security clearance but not the highest level. He lived in a modest apartment in Ramat Gan with his wife and 2 young children. On the surface, he appeared entirely unremarkable, exactly the kind of person who could operate unnoticed within Israeli society. Teams followed Barak for 3 days, documenting his movements, his associates, his routines. On the 3rd day, he met with a woman at a bus stop in central Tel Aviv. The meeting appeared casual, 2 people waiting for different buses engaging in brief conversation. But photographs captured a moment when Barak's hand brushed against the woman's purse as they stood side by side, a movement so subtle that someone not specifically watching for it would have missed it entirely. The woman was identified as Sarah Mizrahi, a secretary in the Ministry of Defense, with access to classified documents and personnel files. The network was beginning to reveal itself, and its structure was more extensive than even Scheffler had initially feared. Each identified member led to others, a branching structure that suggested careful compartmentalization and professional tradecraft. Nightingale was identified as Avram Toledano, a translator in the Foreign Ministry, who handled classified correspondence. Compass turned out to be a supply officer in the Southern Command named Daniel Ashkenazi, who had detailed knowledge of equipment deployments and logistics operations along the Suez front. 2 weeks into the surveillance operation, Amit made another critical discovery. The transmitter he had installed in Fawzi's radio had picked up unusual electronic emissions during one of Fawzi's visits to a cafe, emissions that suggested the presence of another electronic device operating in close proximity. Analysis of the signal pattern indicated it was likely a receiver of some kind, something designed to pick up short-range radio transmissions. This meant the network had a technical capability beyond simple dead drops and physical meetings. They were using electronic communication, probably burst transmissions that could send compressed information in signals lasting only seconds, making interception and direction finding extremely difficult. Amit spent another sleepless night in his workshop, this time designing a receiver that could detect and record these burst transmissions. The device had to be small enough to be carried in a vehicle or worn under clothing, sensitive enough to pick up low-power signals, and sophisticated enough to capture and store the transmissions for later analysis. The technical challenges were substantial. Standard receivers of the era were bulky and power-hungry, designed for continuous monitoring rather than rapid response to brief signals. Amit had to miniaturize components, design efficient power systems using the latest battery technology, and create signal processing circuits that could distinguish meaningful transmissions from background noise. He sketched designs on graph paper, calculated circuit values, tested prototype components on breadboards. The smell of hot solder and burning flux filled the workshop as he assembled and reassembled circuits, each iteration bringing improvements in sensitivity or reductions in size. Working with two other technicians from his division, both sworn to secrecy about the operation's details, he produced 6 prototype units within 72 hours. Surveillance teams were equipped with these receivers, and within 48 hours, they had captured their first transmission. It occurred during one of Fawzi's meetings at the Jaffa Cafe, a burst lasting approximately 4 seconds on a frequency commonly used by commercial taxi services, making it effectively invisible in the normal electromagnetic noise of an urban environment. Amit's receiver had captured the signal, and cryptanalysts working under Scheffler's direct supervision began the painstaking work of attempting to decode it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. One of the cryptanalysts, a young immigrant from Romania named Miriam Weiss, noticed that the burst transmission structure resembled a system she had encountered while studying Soviet intelligence communication methods. She suggested they try applying the number groups from the one-time pad they had found in Fawzi's radio container. It was a long shot. The transmission might have been encrypted using a different pad, or the numbers might not align correctly, but it was a place to start. After 6 hours of painstaking work, testing different sections of the pad against different segments of the transmission, Miriam found the key. The message decoded into a brief intelligence report, updating handlers on the status of several collection efforts and requesting guidance on a new priority target. The message referenced a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday at a location identified by a code phrase, Red Door on German Colony, which intelligence analysts determined likely referred to a specific building in Jerusalem's German Colony neighborhood. Scheffler made the decision to expand the operation to Jerusalem. A separate surveillance team was established, coordinated with the Tel Aviv operation, but maintaining operational separation for security purposes. The building identified as the likely meeting location was a 3-story structure that housed a cultural center on the ground floor and private apartments above. Surveillance teams moved into position on Monday evening, establishing observation posts in buildings with sightlines to all entrances. On Tuesday afternoon, 4 individuals arrived separately at the building within a 30-minute window. 3 were already known to the surveillance teams from the Tel Aviv operation. The 4th was a new face, a man in his late 40s dressed in the conservative style common to Jerusalem's more traditional neighborhoods. Photographs were transmitted immediately to headquarters, where analysts began the process of identification. Within 3 hours, they had a name, Eliezer Ben David, a career civil servant who worked in the Prime Minister's office with access to high-level policy discussions and strategic planning documents. The scope of the penetration was staggering. Egyptian intelligence had managed to place or recruit sources at multiple levels of Israeli government and military, creating a network that could provide comprehensive coverage of Israeli intentions, capabilities, and operations. The presence of someone with Ben David's access meant that Egypt potentially had insight into Israel's most sensitive strategic decision-making, information that could inform their own planning and potentially allow them to anticipate Israeli moves in future confrontations. Schaeffler convened a meeting with Amit, Rachel, and 2 senior analysts in a secure conference room at Mossad headquarters. The walls were soundproofed, the room swept for electronic surveillance devices multiple times daily, and entry was restricted to individuals with specific authorization for this operation. Schaeffler had aged visibly over the past 3 weeks, the weight of the operation and its implications showing in the lines on his face and the exhaustion in his eyes. "We have reached a decision point," Schaeffler began, his voice carrying none of its usual gruffness, only a kind of heavy deliberation. "We have identified 12 individuals with certainty, possibly as many as 6 more that we are still tracking. We have documented their methods, their communication systems, their operational patterns. We have enough to arrest them all and dismantle the network tonight if we choose to do so. The question before us is whether we should do that, or whether we attempt something more ambitious." Rachel spoke first. "If we arrest them now, we stop the bleeding immediately. No more classified information reaches Cairo. We can announce it publicly, show that our security services are effective, restore public confidence. But we also show Egypt exactly what we know about their methods. We burn whatever sources they might have, who we have not identified yet, because they will shut down everything immediately, and we lose any opportunity to use this network for our own purposes." One of the analysts, a methodical man named Uri Feldman, who specialized in counterintelligence strategy, leaned forward. "The alternative is that we attempt to turn this into a controlled channel. We quietly arrest some members, we turn others, we begin feeding false information back to Cairo through the network they believe is still secure. It has risks, enormous risks. If we make a mistake, if one person in the network is more clever than we realize, if Cairo has some method of verifying the information we feed them that we do not know about, then we hand them a propaganda victory and we look incompetent. But if we do it successfully, we can shape their understanding of our capabilities and intentions. We can make them waste resources preparing for threats that do not exist. We can influence their strategic planning based on false assumptions." Amit, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "There is also the technical dimension to consider. We have learned an enormous amount about their communication methods, their encryption systems, their tradecraft. If we simply shut them down, that knowledge becomes historical. But if we control the network, we can potentially identify other Egyptian operations we do not know about yet, because we can monitor what questions they ask and what information they request. Their intelligence priorities will tell us what they care about, what they fear, what they are planning." Schaeffler let the silence stretch after Amit finished speaking. Outside the conference room, the normal sounds of headquarters activity continued, people moving through corridors, telephones ringing, the mundane operations of an intelligence service. But inside this room, a decision was being made that would shape Israel's security posture for years to come. "We do both," Schaeffler said finally. "We arrest the most senior members, the ones with the most dangerous access. Ben David, Toledano, Ashkenazi. We make those arrests quietly, no public announcement, and we replace them with our own people who will continue to appear to provide information, but who will actually be feeding controlled material. The lower-level members, the couriers and support personnel, we leave in place, but we watch them constantly. Fawzi we expel on diplomatic grounds, but we do it in a way that suggests we found something minor, not this entire network. Egypt will believe they have lost one channel, but that their primary sources are still secure." The plan was elegant in its complexity and terrifying in its potential for catastrophic failure. The arrests of Ben David, Toledano and Ashkenazi were conducted simultaneously on a Thursday morning at 4 o'clock, when residential neighborhoods were quiet, and the chance of witnesses was minimal. Each man was taken by teams of Shin Bet operatives who had trained specifically for these kinds of operations, entering homes with skeleton keys provided by lock specialists, securing subjects before they could destroy evidence or alert others, conducting rapid searches for communication devices or hidden materials. Ben David was found with a miniature camera, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf, containing partially exposed film that later revealed photographs of classified policy briefings. Toledano had files of translated documents hidden beneath floorboards in his study, copies he had made over months of handling sensitive correspondence. Ashkenazi had detailed notes about equipment locations and supply routes, written in a personal shorthand that cryptanalysts would spend weeks decoding. The interrogations were conducted by specialists who understood that the goal was not simply to extract confessions, but to understand the full scope of the network, identify any members still unknown, and determine exactly what information had been compromised. Each interrogation followed a carefully structured approach, beginning with confrontation with irrefutable evidence, moving through detailed questioning about methods and contacts, and eventually offering cooperation agreements in exchange for comprehensive debriefing. The interrogation rooms were austere spaces, furnished only with a table, several chairs, and recording equipment that documented every word spoken. Interrogators worked in rotating shifts, maintaining pressure while avoiding the appearance of physical coercion. They brought documents, photographs, surveillance logs, creating an overwhelming impression that everything was already known and that resistance was pointless. The psychological effect was precisely calculated, designed to break down resistance through the weight of evidence rather than through intimidation or threats. All three men eventually cooperated, though their motivations for having committed espionage varied dramatically. Ben David had been recruited during a cultural exchange visit to Europe 10 years earlier, compromised through a honey trap operation involving a woman he had met at a conference in Vienna. He had been providing information ever since, motivated initially by blackmail and later by a combination of financial payments and ideological sympathy with pan-Arab nationalism. Toledano had been motivated purely by ideology, believing that Israel's policies toward Palestinians and Arab neighbors were fundamentally unjust, and that providing information to Egypt served a higher moral purpose. Ashkenazi had started by providing what he considered minor information in exchange for money to pay gambling debts, and had then been trapped by the realization that he had already committed espionage and faced prison if he stopped. With the cooperation of these three, Mossad was able to construct a comprehensive map of the network's structure, identifying 16 individuals in total, including several who had not yet been detected through surveillance. The network had been operational for nearly 5 years, surviving the tensions leading up to the Six-Day War and continuing afterward. The volume of classified information that had been compromised was extensive enough that military and government agencies spent months conducting damage assessments, determining what Egypt knew and how that knowledge might affect future operations. The controlled channel operation ran for nearly 2 years. The 3 senior sources were replaced by Mossad officers who assumed their identities within the network, continuing to provide information, but now under complete Israeli control. The false information fed to Egypt through the channel was carefully crafted to be plausible enough to maintain credibility while being strategically misleading. Reports suggested Israeli military capabilities that were either understated or overstated, depending on what effect Israeli planners wanted to achieve. Intelligence about Israeli intentions regarding the occupied territories was shaped to influence Egyptian strategic planning in directions favorable to Israeli interests. The operation came to a carefully orchestrated conclusion in the summer of 1969, when Israeli intelligence made the decision to publicly expose the network. The timing was chosen to coincide with broader diplomatic initiatives, and the public revelation served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Israeli security competence. It embarrassed Egyptian intelligence publicly. It provided justification for certain policy positions Israel was taking in negotiations, and it allowed for the quiet removal of the lower-level network members who had been left in place during the controlled channel phase. Mahmoud Fawzi was expelled from Israel with considerable publicity, identified as the coordinator of an espionage network that had been discovered and neutralized. His photograph appeared in newspapers across Israel and internationally. Egyptian officials denounced the accusations as fabrications, but the evidence was substantial enough that their denials carried little weight. Several other Egyptian diplomats were also expelled or recalled to Cairo. The shop owner, Mossad, was arrested and prosecuted for serving as an intermediary in the network. His trial revealed that he had been providing services to Egyptian intelligence for over a decade, beginning long before the State of Israel existed, continuing through the War of Independence and subsequent conflicts. He received a lengthy prison sentence. Yosef Barak, the Broadcasting Authority technician, was also prosecuted and imprisoned. Sarah Mizrahi, the Defense Ministry Secretary, accepted a cooperation agreement and provided extensive testimony about her recruitment and handling, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange. For Amit, Rachel, and the others who had worked the operation, the conclusion brought a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. They had successfully identified and neutralized a significant security threat. They had turned a dangerous penetration into a controlled intelligence channel, and they had prevented an unknown amount of future damage. But they also lived with the knowledge of how much information had been compromised before the network was discovered, and the understanding that there were likely other networks they had not yet identified. In the years that followed, the broken car radio became something of a legend within Israeli intelligence circles, a reminder that sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come from paying attention to small anomalies, from trusting the instincts of observant analysts, and from patient, methodical investigation. Rachel's career advanced rapidly. Her role in identifying the initial surveillance pattern recognized as exemplary intelligence work. Amit continued developing technical surveillance capabilities, his innovations in electronic tracking and signal interception becoming foundational to Israeli intelligence methods in subsequent decades. Schäffler retired a few years after the operation concluded, his career capped by this success, but also marked by the burden of knowing how close Israel had come to being comprehensively penetrated at the highest levels. In his retirement, he occasionally lectured at intelligence training courses, always emphasizing the importance of assuming that adversaries are more sophisticated than they appear, that security is a constant process rather than a state that can be achieved, and that vigilance must be maintained even in moments of apparent triumph. The broader historical implications of the operation resonated for years. The network's existence during the period leading up to the Six-Day War raised questions about whether Egyptian intelligence had provided warnings that were not properly assessed by Egyptian military planners. The fact that the network continued operating even after Egypt's military defeat suggested a bureaucratic separation between intelligence collection and operational planning, a dysfunction that would continue to plague Egyptian security services. For Israel, the operation reinforced the understanding that the intelligence war with neighboring states was continuous and multifaceted, fought not only through dramatic operations, but through patient, methodical counterintelligence work. The techniques developed during the operation, particularly the technical surveillance methods Amit had pioneered, became standard practice and were refined through subsequent operations against other adversaries. The story of the broken radio also illustrated the human dimensions of espionage. Each person involved in the network, from the highly placed sources to the support personnel, had made individual choices to betray their country. Their motivations varied, some ideological, some financial, some personal, but each represented a failure of loyalty that could have had catastrophic consequences. Understanding these motivations, preventing future recruitment, and maintaining the trust that holds intelligence services together became ongoing priorities for Israeli security officials. In the final analysis, the operation succeeded not because of any single brilliant insight or dramatic intervention, but because of systematic attention to detail, patience in developing understanding, and careful coordination among professionals who trusted each other and their methods. Rachel's initial observation of an unusual pattern, Amit's meticulous technical work, Schäffler's strategic decision-making, and the efforts of dozens of surveillance specialists, analysts, and operatives combined to produce a result that protected Israeli security during a critical period. The Peugeot 404, with its malfunctioning radio, that seemingly mundane vehicle that started everything, was eventually donated to the Mossad training facility, where it was displayed as an educational tool. New recruits were told its story, shown how the radio concealed its secrets, and taught the lesson that intelligence work often begins with someone noticing that something is slightly wrong, that a pattern does not quite fit, that what appears normal might actually be carefully constructed cover. The car sat in that facility for decades, its silver paint fading, its tires eventually replaced, but its radio carefully preserved exactly as Amit had found it, a testament to the power of patient observation and meticulous investigation. The shadow war between intelligence services continued long after this operation concluded, new methods replacing old ones, new technologies, enabling capabilities that would have seemed impossible in 1967. But the fundamental principles remained constant. The need for vigilance, the importance of questioning assumptions, the value of systematic investigation, and the understanding that security is never permanent but must be constantly maintained through the efforts of dedicated professionals who work in anonymity. Their successes often hidden, their failures potentially catastrophic. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.